That's everybody in the waiting room so far. I think we'll make a start, and then if more people come, I'll just add them. So thank you everyone for attending this virtual pupillage session today. Hopefully it helps you in providing you with advice and guidance on the upcoming pupillage process. So I know portal opens in January and a lot of people are probably trying to get their applications done and prepared, but also preparing for interviews as well. So I'd like to really say a massive thank you to our panel members today, Sahar, Gurdeep and Francesca. Thank you so much for coming today and taking the time out to give the students tips on pupillage. And I think if I could just pass it over to my colleague, just Kira, just before we start, I think he just wanted to say something quickly. So just Kira, if I could just ask you quickly to say what you've got to say.
Good evening, everyone. Hope you guys are having a nice day. Just here to simply say thank you first and foremost for joining us, and thank you the panel members. Obviously, I'm looking for pupillage myself, so I know how important this webinar is. We have a future event coming up in January, and it's called Sikhs and Human Rights. In this, what we will be discussing is the martyrdom or the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, the 9th Sikh Guru who gave up his life to save another religion, and then further on how the 4 Char Sahib, the 4 sons of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, gave Shahidi and gave the life away for the rights of other individuals. It's a very important webinar, so I expect a lot of people to join in and sign up into this. And to make it more special, well, I'm trying to arrange a very special guest for this seminar. I'm not going to say the name right now, but I'll drop you a hint. This is also known as Mr. Charity. So those who know who I'm talking about will be straight on the ball, but I'll keep it a surprise until everything is finalized. So I'll look forward to seeing you all in January, and then hopefully we'll be able to host this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Just Kira. Also, just another event we're preparing in relation to pupillage is we're trying to arrange an event called From a Pupil's Perspective. So we're trying to get pupils who are currently undertaking pupillage or have just completed their pupillage to kind of give you some guidance on what life would be like as a pupil. So if I could just ask the panel members to begin. So if Gurdeep, Baji, if you want to ask. And if I could ask everyone if you could just mute yourselves while the speakers are speaking. Yeah, Baji, would you like to start?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking Tanessa for her kind invitation to speak at this event. I'm told that each of us has been given about 15 minutes in which to make some observations about pupillage applications, the process, and maybe impart some hints and tips. And so I'll try and be as quick as possible and try and cover as much material as I can. I think the starting point is to obviously have in mind the level of competition. And I don't say that as a negative point, but you all know that there is a huge amount of competition in terms of people chasing these pupillages. I'll just pause there, Tanessa, because I can hear some noise. It's like somebody's into some sports commentary or something. So I don't know if we're able to switch that off.
Yeah, I'll just go through and see who it is.
It's not me being precious, but it's just simply because there's quite a lot of distortion.
Can I ask everyone to mute their mics because I can't see who it is on the list?
No, that's fine. All right.
No, it's still going on. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, I can hear you. I think somebody's still got their mics on, but it's not showing on the list.
Right, well, let's
I don't want to unduly embarrass anyone, but I think Max, whoever's got their display name is Max, I think you're the only one I'm seeing is unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me carry on for now, and obviously if that's fine, if they can switch it off in due course. So to return to the point I was just about to make, as you know, there's a huge amount of competition for pupillage. I think looking at the figures over the last couple of years, there's something like 1,500 people who complete the course each year. There are about 500 pupillages nationally, and there are of course the people from the year before and the year before that who are still in the mix trying to chase pupillage. And so what's essential, and it's obviously stating the obvious, but what's essential is you have to make your application stand out so that anybody reading that application in a chambers or even in a firm who take on barristers will look at it and think this is somebody who we have to take on. Generally speaking, most people who will apply for pupillage have similar academic background in the sense that they have good A-levels. Most people have a 2-1, and so you have to ensure that your application stands out from the crowd. And there are things that you can do in order to be able to do that. A few tips. It's essential that you pick and choose the sets that you're going to apply to. Don't just apply to sets all over the country who cover all sorts of work. Identify the area of law that you're interested in and apply only to those sets. And the reason I say that is because, for example, in my chambers, every year we get applications from people across the country, some of whom will say, well, I'm interested in family work or commercial work. And you just think, well, if you'd bother to do any research, you'd see that this is a criminal set. And plainly, you're simply just applying for pupillage. You're not applying in a focused way. So research the set fully. Don't just carpet bomb applications across the country. As I said, target the ones where you think this is a set that seems to match my interests, my aims, and apply to those sets. Analyze the pupils that those sets have taken on recently and try and identify the common features. And so try and, for example, see where those people may have gone to university and try and see if there's any trend that you can identify that might make you the sort of candidate that they might be looking for. Now, a couple of more obvious things, but they're worth spelling out because, again, every year, I'm sure Francesca and Sahar will bear me out on this. Every year, we receive applications in which there are spelling errors, grammatical errors, and these are all things which really are unforgivable. You are trainee barristers, prospective barristers who are supposedly at the forefront and cutting edge of advocacy, and an application for pupillage is a form of usually written advocacy. And so you must spend as much time as possible crafting your application, checking it, double checking it and triple checking it, and then getting other people to read it over, because those sorts of things are unforgivable. They stand out off the page, and any pupillage committee that has to deal with an application that has errors of that sort will take a relatively dim view. In my chambers, we insist on a handwritten cover letter to accompany an application, so perhaps an old-fashioned approach, but again, it's deliberately so because it's a skill, writing a letter. It's a form of written advocacy, and again, one can tell quite a bit about an applicant by the way that they can structure a letter and put together a presentation within a couple of sides within that letter. And so that then takes me on to CVs. There is no magic formula as to a CV, but in my view, I don't know whether the other panel members will agree, but a CV should be no more than 2 sides. When we're faced with applications, both letters and CVs that run to 4 or 5 or 6 pages, of course we will read them, but frankly, they become a little bit tiresome. And one of the skills of a barrister is being able to distill and to dilute, if you like, and identify what's really important and to present it in a succinct way. And so presenting the material succinctly is a key skill in any event. And so those applications, whether submitted through the portal or as standalone applications, are your first contact with chambers, and it has to be a good impression. I'm a big fan of the idea of doing a mini pupillage in a set. It's not essential because, of course, sometimes it's not possible, particularly in the last 12 months with COVID. People in your position won't have been able to do as many mini pupillages as was usually the case. But the advantage of having done a mini pupillage in a set that you're applying to is, of course, that you are then able to say, look, I have been in your chambers, I have been with members of chambers in court and in and around chambers. I like the atmosphere, I like the collegiate feel, I like the sort of work that you do. So it gives you an advantage. So you're talking from a position of knowledge. And so if at all possible, try to apply for a mini pupillage, even if it's only a couple of days, so that you then, when you come to apply for a formal pupillage, you can talk, as it were, with knowledge of that set. Over and above those things, in terms of enhancing your chances, marshalling with a judge, whether it's a Crown Court judge, a County Court judge, district judge, that's again, if possible, something that really will help. It will give you a different perspective of a courtroom. You'll see advocacy from a different angle. And again, it also is a way of testing your mettle, because spending a week or even a few days with a judge is never an easy thing. And if you can hold your own in that environment, and at the end of it, the judge is kind enough, for example, to give you a reference, that will look good on your application, because it shows that you have a certain confidence, you have a certain poise, and you're comfortable in that arena. But other things that you can do to enhance your application, some of these will be obvious, and I know you'll be doing them, but advocacy experience, debating experience, some of which you'll have done at university, some of which you'll be doing at bar school, is again really important. So it doesn't always have to be formal, whether it's informal at university, anything where you can demonstrate that you have been on your feet, you've presented arguments, you've been persuasive, whether in writing or orally, that again is something which will set you apart from the crowd. So those are all things that I think, in terms of making your application stand out and making it look as though this is somebody who doesn't just like the idea of being a barrister, this is somebody who's actually done some legwork. And just before I leave the issue of mini pupillages, just by way of illustration, and it may be that I went a bit over the top, but when I applied for pupillage in the mid-90s, having finished university, I think over a 3-year period, I did 12 or 13 mini pupillages. I used to do 3 or 4 a year. The advantage of doing that was that it enabled me to have a feel and insight into a variety of different sets. Large sets in London, smaller sets in the provinces, criminal sets, common law sets, family sets. And so when I was applying to the sorts of sets that I wanted to do pupillage in, again, I had real knowledge of how they were set up, what the environment was like. And again, that's something which I think is, if you can do it, will really help you, because it just gives you an introduction and an insight into what it's actually like in a barrister's chambers. A few words about interviews and preparing for pupillage interviews. Again, as I've already said, learn about the set. You're lucky now, it wasn't the case when I applied, and probably when Francesca applied. We've now got the internet, and most chambers have pretty good websites, and you can learn a lot about the set, the sort of work that they do, the people, the sort of cases that they're involved in. And so there's no excuse not to do your research. And it shows that you have a genuine interest in the set. Another thing to be wary of is that if you're invited for pupillage, the people who are interviewing you will have scrutinized both your application and your CV. And so be prepared to explain the gaps that there may be in your CV, because that's what we look for. Explain to us why there's a year in between finishing university and bar school, or why didn't you move seamlessly from one to another? More often than not, the explanation is perfectly acceptable, but it's something that sometimes people are unprepared for. So, you know, if you think that there are weaknesses in your application or gaps, be prepared to deal with them and be candid. So, for example, if your A-levels weren't the strongest, but then later at university you really improved, and that was demonstrated by a good mark on your degree and a good mark at bar school, be prepared to argue your position, to say, look, I've recently demonstrated real academic rigor, whereas my A-levels may not have been as strong, but over the last 3 or 4 years, over a long period of time, I've demonstrated academic success and rigor, and therefore you should judge me now in the present rather than something I did when I was a 17 or 18-year-old. So again, don't be afraid of any gaps or weaknesses in your application. Sometimes you have to embrace them. A few words about practical aspects of interviews. Speaking for my set, one change that we made about 3 years ago is that we've now anonymized applications, in the sense of we no longer ask for the university that you're attending, because as you'll all know, there has been for a number of years a bias, whether conscious or unconscious, an Oxbridge Russell Group bias. I'm not sure that was a good thing, and our set, as most sets now, have sought to address that by anonymizing where people went to university. And so as long as we know what your university degree classification was, we go from there rather than fixate on where you did your degree. So again, for those of you who have been to perhaps less established universities, don't view that necessarily as fatal. It's all about you and what you can bring to the table. So in terms of interviews, one thing that we do in my chambers, and I think many chambers do, is we ask candidates ethical questions. So make sure that you, for example, read the Code of Ethics, and we will give candidates a couple of scenarios and ask them to deal with ethical questions that arise from those scenarios, real life scenarios of the sorts of things that could happen to you if you're in court. So again, prepare for things like that, because it's the sort of thing that puts you on the spot, tests you, and is a good measure of being able to see whether you can react well under pressure. Another aspect, which is perhaps more conventional, which you'll all be familiar with, is most interviews, particularly second interviews, contain some element of advocacy exercise. We tend to move each year either between a bail application or a plea in mitigation. You'll be confronted with a miserable judge, just again to test you. But again, it's something which, if you've prepared well, you'll be absolutely fine, and it's not something that you will be alien to you, and embrace it as an opportunity to show that you're an effective advocate and that you're able to put your arguments well, even though we recognise that you're under pressure because you're in a pupillage interview. One thing I will say, because I think a lot of candidates have this attitude, if you're selected for an interview, don't put yourself under undue pressure. All pupillage selection panels want you to succeed. We haven't wasted an evening or a Saturday morning inviting you for an interview because we want to embarrass or humiliate you. We want you to do well. So make sure you remember that and treat it as an opportunity to perform, rather than loading yourself with a huge burden or weight on your shoulders and then being cowed by that weight. So take the opportunity, give yourself a few deep breaths and think, right, this is my chance, and I'm within touching distance, because that's what a second interview represents. You're within touching distance. They've liked your application, they've liked your letter, so you're within touching distance of pupillage. Make sure you perform and make sure that you impress. A couple of other things that I will say is try to be yourself. Sounds an obvious thing to say, but every year we're confronted with people who turn up for an interview and they put on a persona. It's almost a persona as though they think this is what a barrister should be like and this is how a barrister should behave. And often they come across as very wooden and they show no warmth and no personality. And so that's not what you should do. I think you should try as much as you can to relax, try and be yourself, because if you let your personality shine and if you relax, everything else will then flow. And one thing that all chambers look for are people who are going to fit into the team, because the idea is we're going to invest in you quite a lot of money and a year's worth of training, and we want you to stay within our chambers for the next 15, 20 years or for however long. And so most chambers will think, right, we want somebody who we think seems like a good person, seems like somebody we can have a bit of a laugh with, somebody who will be a good colleague going forward. So try to strike the right balance between being formal and being presentable and being articulate, but also not being too wooden. Those are things that I would suggest are really important in terms of interviews. In terms of specific questions which are stock, make sure you've prepared those. Each year, every chambers will ask you, well, why do you want to be a barrister? In our chambers, we will ask, why do you want to do criminal work rather than family or commercial or civil? So these are all things which you should have prepared and well prepared and have in mind. Don't be caught out by under preparation of those basic stock answers. But over and above those sort of basic introductory questions, which are designed just to get you talking and relaxing, the other sorts of areas that you'll be asked about are things like, tell us about an area of law that you think needs addressing or reform. Again, it's deliberately designed to check whether you are keeping abreast of current developments and issues, and also to express a view. So don't give us both sides of the argument. Try, if you can, to express your opinion, because again, it shows judgment, it shows an ability, and it shows some degree of confidence. And so that's always an interesting question. More often than not, people will speak about an interesting topic. Last year, I remember one of the applicants was very impressively spoke about Section 28 cross-examination and was quite interested in that. And we were very impressed by her ability to engage on that topic. We might ask something like, well, what do you think about the legalization of cannabis? Is it a gateway to crime, or is it a solution, and so on and so forth? So be alive to issues that lawyers discuss, that barristers discuss, and that are topical and current around us. And again, an obvious one that springs to mind that is very much in all our hearts and minds is funding at the bar, and particularly for youngsters coming into the bar and the criminal bar. We are all very anxious about funding and the cuts in funding, and how do youngsters make a career at the bar? So again, put some thought into those sorts of things, because it will show that you are well prepared. But again, there may be other less obvious questions, just to, again, get you relaxed and just to see what you're like. And so, for example, last year, we asked candidates, apropos nothing, well, tell us what book you're reading at the moment. And again, it's just a measure of how relaxed is this person, how able are they to engage with, you know, a panel of 6 or 7 people under pressure when they want to impress. So that's a quick run through, guys, of things that I think sometimes are perhaps overlooked. I'm sorry if some of them are blindingly obvious, but again, they're worth and bear repeating. I hope some of those things are helpful. And as I've said to Tanessa before we began, if at the end there are specific questions that any of you have, I'd be happy to deal with those.
Thank you, Gurdeep Baji. We will be having a Q&A session at the end. So I've seen there's quite a few questions in the chat. So if I could ask everyone, we will get back to those at the end and ask the panel members to answer some of the questions. If I could move on to Francesca now.
Thank you, Tanessa, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I've just somehow managed to enlarge the group chat. I'm not quite sure how I've managed that. And thank you also to Gurdeep for starting us off. In fact, I now feel as if I'm playing for the second defendant in a trial, and he's given his closing speech and taken all of my best points. So I'm going to flounder my way through this, but try and be as helpful as possible. There might be a bit of duplication, but I hope you forgive me for that. I want to talk to you in the first instance about the research that you should be doing in relation to your applications. And part of that is echoing what Gurdeep has already said. You can, of course, through the gateway, check chambers adverts. You should have a look at the handbook and see what it is that you can learn about chambers, and ensure that you definitely want to apply to that particular set, not just because, for instance, you've heard lots about it. It's got to be suitable for you. Check their track record for recruiting pupils. We take our pupillage application process really seriously because it is with a view to tenancy. We don't simply get a whole horde of people through our doors, offer pupillage out to 6 people and then maybe take one on every 3 years. So our pupillage recruitment is perhaps a little more intense than it may be for other sets, but that's because it is with a view to tenancy. And that's important for you because if, for instance, you're applying to a set that has a whole host of pupils, you've got to remember that you're going to be in competition with them when it comes to tenancy. Have a look at the track record. If they've only taken on 1 or 2 in the last 10 years, then are you actually being used as fodder to make sure that you're sent out to the far reaches of the UK to go and do all of the jobbing work to enable the more senior members in the chambers to acquire decent cases at your expense? So it's important that you know the type of set that you're applying to and whether you're happy to go there. Similarly to what Gurdeep has said, if Chambers' core practice is crime, then don't go there and expect to have an excellent housing law practice and to tell them how much you want to do a housing law practice there. It may sound basic, as Gurdeep said, but I have had applicants who have applied to us wanting to progress with housing or public law, and that really isn't the kind of pupillage that we give, and it's not even the sort of thing that we can really offer any kind of assistance in, as it's not the type of law that we specialise in. Have a look as well as to how pupillage is structured. So at 5 St Andrews Hill, rather than have a pupil master for each of the 6 months, sorry, that's old terminology, a pupil supervisor for each period of 6 months, we have one every 4 months. And that means that during the difficult transition that you have from being a first 6 pupil and shadowing to then getting on your feet, you're then with somebody that is familiar with you, that you feel you've already got a rapport with, to ask those awkward questions that you might want necessarily not to rehearse in front of someone that you barely know. So have a look at how it's structured. What training do they offer? What are their minimum degree requirements? At 5 St Andrews Hill, we asked for a minimum of a 2-1. But one of our members, for instance, Andrew Bird, who's just got Silk in the recent announcement, he was a 2-2, and yet he is the brightest person in Chambers. But there may be extenuating circumstances that you want to refer to. I say go for it. If it's a set that you really want to go to and you don't quite make the requirements, explain why you don't, explain why something might have happened that's caused a hiccup, and see if you can get through the door that way. Certainly I'm head of pupillage, and myself and the others within the pupillage committee never reject an application as of right because the standards aren't there. But you do need to go the extra mile if you haven't quite got that 2-1, which is generally our minimum requirement. Another thing that you want to consider, I know that you're probably all desperate for pupillage and you'll accept anything that comes your way, but actually make sure that the chambers you're applying to deserve you. Do they have a decent maternity policy, a paternity policy, a parenting leave policy? Do they have a proven equality and diversity policy? All of those sorts of things show that you're working with decent people who care about your well-being. It's a poison chalice to get pupillage, but at a set that really doesn't appreciate your worth. So make sure you want to go there, and make sure they deserve you. So that's the first bit of advice I give. Do your research, make sure that chambers you apply to is one where you feel that you can grow and be supported. Next bit of advice I'd say is plan ahead. I don't know whether or not you are applying in January for 2022 or whether you're looking more long term. But by the time you submit your applications, I agree wholeheartedly with Gurdeep that you should have undertaken some mini pupillages. If you can do some marshalling, absolutely fantastic. I didn't do it and wish I had, because it's an amazing insight into the way in which the bar works and how you're perceived by judges. If you have set your sights on a number of sets of chambers, try to set up a mini with them in advance of making the application. And if you can't commit, for instance, to a whole week, then ask if there's a day or two that you can shadow someone, or ask if they can bear you in mind if any interesting sentencing hearings come up, or client conferences that are being conducted via Zoom, to see whether or not you can join in via Zoom or CVP. It may not always be possible, and it may depend on whether the client or the judge gives permission, but if sufficient notice is given, then permission can be sought in advance. And even if it can't work out, at least you've shown willing and you're above the radar when it comes to that particular set. As Gurdeep says, by the time you apply, most of you will already have a similar high standard of education, so you'll need to set yourself apart. If you're at uni, get yourself involved in mooting and debates. Get involved with your inn to have the inter-inn mooting competitions and things like that. If there's a law clinic available at your university, apply to that, get involved, get engaged in innocent projects. If you can get the funding in place, do a death row internship if you can. Get involved with things like the Free Representation Unit, domestic violence aid groups, school exclusion projects, anything where you can show an interest in being an advocate, in helping the little person, as that's really important, particularly in criminal law, and to make sure that you keep your advocacy up. If you are applying for the third or fourth time and you've not had success yet, be ready to explain in your application form how you've improved from the previous year and how you are keeping your hand in advocacy, not simply doing paralegaling work. They all have their place to play, but certainly if you're focusing very much on paralegal work and not doing your advocacy, then that's something that the interview panel may pick you up on. Another set of advice, I suppose, is many sets offer things like free webinars, seminars and things like that via Zoom at the moment because of the way in which we're all existing. Certainly 5 St Andrews Hill offer a regular seminar programme, and they are recorded, and links to those are placed on our YouTube account with the links available via our website. Have a look at them, watch them, work out who are the people involved, pick up on 1 or 2 things that are said during the course of that webinar, and feed that into your application form. You can say, I watched the webinar on the sentencing code and I was inspired by the way that your most junior tenant, Amy Wolfson, was able to deliver a really helpful insight into the new Act. It shows that you've got an interest in Chambers, that you've actually watched the webinar and that you've taken something from it. And it may well be that the person that you're mentioning is on the Pupillage Committee and gets a bit of flattery at the same time, in which case, again, all well and good. But webinars and seminars help you keep abreast of the changes in the law. And if you feed reference to these in your answers in your application form, then they also demonstrate that you're genuinely interested in Chambers and you want to be there. When seminars can resume in person, ask if you can come along. For certainly 5 St Andrews Hill, they're always advertised on our webpage. Get in touch with the link there. If there is room for you to come and join us, then come and join us. If it's oversubscribed, it might be that you can simply link into the recording afterwards. But again, your head's above the parapet, you're on the radar, you're showing an interest in Chambers. If you are able to come along, then not only are you able to experience the feel for Chambers and get to know people in Chambers, but there's always drinks and nibbles afterwards, which gives you an excellent opportunity to network, which is really important. If you have already completed your BPTC and you are paralegaling, then try your best to undertake some paralegaling in the field that you ultimately want pupillage in. Criminal paralegal work, particularly with some of the bigger white-collar crime firms, can pay well. They'll also provide you with an excellent understanding of how the digital case system works, how to get the best out of your client, what's expected of counsel from a lawyer's, solicitor's perspective. And if you are lucky enough to be able to sit behind counsel in court, it means that you'll have exposure to their advocacy skills and learn from them as well, which is something that you can feed into your early years of practice. If, of course, you do well during your paralegaling, then the likelihood is that firm will support you when you're on your feet. And Chambers will have that in mind, that you have excellent contacts, which may ultimately benefit them. And that's not a bad position to be in. It also demonstrates to Chambers, again, that you can network, because you could be an excellent advocate with a brilliant track record and an excellent case preparation skills with an eye for detail. But if networking isn't done properly, then your career isn't going to grow. So that's an important skill to have. For your application form, if you have done loads of mini pupillages, I would suggest that you choose 1 or 2 brilliant experiences to put on your form, including a mini that you may have had at the set that you're applying to, and then you can list the others that you've undertaken with the year that you undertook them and the name of the set alongside. And if you remember who you were shadowing, put their name in brackets, as they may have made notes on your experience with them. The only exception to this is if you have no other legal experience because you're just starting out, then you may wish to list all of your minis individually, but be succinct in your description. You can identify, for instance, that you undertook criminal pupillage at 5 St Andrews Hill with Francesca Levett, who was undertaking a 5-day rape trial, and then you can say briefly what you learned from the experience. And I'd say that's really all you need. A lot of the pupillage committee are going through literally hundreds of forms. Some of them are 20, 25 pages long. And so if you get too bogged down in too much similar information, it can be a bit off-putting. So be succinct, as you would want to be in robust submissions in court. Now, if you haven't been able to plan ahead and undertake minis because COVID has ruined your mini pupillages, or you've not been able to get signed off on your free representation unit, then explain that in your form, but also set out what you plan to do about it. Now, I have had applications in the past where applicants haven't undertaken a single mini pupillage, or if they have, then they've made no mention of it. When I've come across those forms, I have no idea at all whether the applicant was actually committed to a career at the bar. I didn't know whether the lack of minis was down to arrogance or ignorance or naivety or something else entirely. Now, if you only have 1 or 2 mini pupillages that you've undertaken, that's absolutely fine, but explain why. Now, personally, I struggled to fit in mini pupillages because I had to work all the way through every single holiday, all the way through uni, college, school, even bar school, and even during my first 6 months as an unfunded pupil, because I simply need to make ends meet. And so I always felt at a disadvantage when many of my university cohort were able to undertake pupillage after pupillage, mini pupillage after mini pupillage. And I felt that their CV was going to be full of all of these experiences, whereas I could only say that I'd done 1 or 2. Now, I finally ended up doing 3 mini pupillages back to back, having taken a year off between uni and bar school, just so that I could get on a better sort of financial footing. And the minis were actually instrumental in helping me decide what sort of career I wanted. Prior to the minis, I wanted to go into personal injury work and be in the provinces. And then by the end of my first week, I knew that crime actually was for me, and I wanted to be in London, where at that time, certainly it seemed faster paced with more variety and a greater chance of career progression. And I never looked back. And I've been doing this for 23 years now, and I absolutely love my job because I had the experience to know what decision I wanted to make. So it is important to undertake mini pupillages if you can. And as I say, if you're not able to do as many as you'd like because you have to work, then from a very personal perspective, I have absolute respect for anybody that works through their education. Not only have I done it, and so I understand what you're going through, but it demonstrates to me and the others on my panel that you can juggle many responsibilities and still succeed. So use that to your advantage, because certainly at the bar, we're always juggling responsibilities and burning the midnight oil. So far as the application form itself is concerned, as you know, 5 St Andrews Hill are a gateway set, so we don't have a covering letter or a CV, but you have to fulfil the application form with some of the generic questions that appear on every form, but also some that are more personal to us. Your attention to detail is important. Gurdeep said it, and I cannot reiterate it enough. Spelling errors stick out like a sore thumb. And if you tell me in your application form why it is that you would love to join Garden Court Chambers when you're actually applying to us at 5 St Andrews Hill, you earn no brownie points at all. It's just so disappointing when somebody does that. as advocates, you need to adapt your precedents and work hard and present work that is going to impress a judge, and you need to show at least the same level of detail in your applications, but bearing in mind it's the most important application you're ever going to make, perhaps a bit more so. Adapt your form to reflect what is important to each set. A generic answer also sticks out like a sore thumb. Telling me I'm applying to your chambers because you practice in crime and you're the leaders in your field actually screams out that you've simply copied and pasted that in each and every form. Whereas if you tell me that you're applying to 5 St Andrews Hill because you practice in crime and many of your tenants, including Andrew Bird, James Fletcher and Gary Pons, are recognised as being the leaders in their field in the Legal 500, demonstrates that you've definitely done your research, that you've tailored your application to 5 St Andrews Hill because you know about us and you want to come here. So check out Chambers entries in the Legal 500 or Chambers and Partners. Do a bit of name dropping in your application forms, I would say, because it demonstrates to me that you are doing your research. Tap into a webinar and comment upon it so that we know that you're interested enough to have taken that extra step. When it comes to listing your achievements, I'd say try and be as objective as you can. Tell us if you're a scholar for your inn. Tell us if you got to the finals of a moot or the semi-finals of a moot. Tell us if you've headed up a law clinic or participated in a particularly tricky case. Those kind of achievements are the ones that we want to know about. I don't want to know that you were a prefect or that you came second in the 800 metres in year 5. It really weakens your application. So be selective and be objective. Be careful about the use of humour. Personally, I like it. I like humour, but it's got to match my own, of course. So just like in text messages, so much can be misinterpreted in writing. Also, you don't know in advance who your audience is going to be on that form. Giving a scornful comment, for instance, about Donald Trump may reflect the collective views of you and your peers. It might even meet the views of the Pupillage Committee, but you don't know that. And the 1 or 2 people who initially assess your form may think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, in which case your humour goes down like a lead balloon. So as a rule of thumb, I would suggest leaving politics to one side. If you are going to put in humour, make sure it's self-deprecating rather than at anyone else's expense. But if you're in doubt as to whether you should be including humour in your form, as a rule of thumb, I'd say leave it out. And finally on the form, read the questions properly. Weave in your experience that you've collected within your answers. Tell us why you choose us. Tell us why you chose to be a barrister. Tell us what the greatest challenge you faced so far. I saw one of the questions come up as to whether or not you should weave in personal experience in relation to that, because you don't want to look as if you're trying to fly the flag of extenuating circumstances. If you personally have had a really difficult challenge that you've had to face and you've done so particularly well, then sell it, because it makes you a human being at the end of the day. So personally, I say, be honest, tell us about your personal experiences, as long as it is a particularly good challenge that you've had to meet. Don't ever give us an answer that you think you want us to hear. We want to hear from you, and we want to know that you're going to be a good fit when it comes to chambers. And finally, then, in relation to interviews themselves, I echo again, Gurdeep, when I say be yourself. Personality is so, so important. If you're you and it works out, then you know that you're going to be a good fit in chambers. If you've pretended to be something that you think we want you to be, and you're not that person at all, then you may end up with a pupillage, but you're not going to be happy ultimately. So it's really important that your personality comes across. We want to know that not only are you a safe pair of hands and someone that we're going to trust to our most vulnerable clients and perhaps our most prolific instructing solicitor, but we also need to know that you're going to have our backs, that when we can go to the pub with you, you're going to be a good laugh, that you're going to have that personality, and that you are going to fit in with us. We all have good days and bad days, and we need to know that you're going to be there for us in the same way that we're going to be there for you. That said, of course, advocates have to be skillful in their powers of persuasion. They need to be able to articulate what they want to say very well. So be yourself, but understand your surroundings. Don't be too pally in the pupillage interview, but do, of course, still make your personality come out. It's a fine balance. Now, certainly in 5 St Andrews Hill, we either produce a discussion topic or a legal question that's given to you when you arrive. So it's not something you can necessarily prepare for. Very often there's no right or wrong answer. We take account of the fact that everyone comes to us from all walks of life and at different stages. We know that we'll have undergraduates who might be doing a history degree with the view to doing GDL at some point. We might have someone that is a 4th round applicant and is long suffering in a paralegal position. So we do take account of that fact, and we meet accordingly with the discussion document that we're given. No prior legal knowledge is required. If we are doing a legal question, then what we do is we produce all of the relevant statutes or case authorities that you might need to read and be aware of. But more recently, we have done discussion topics, so something that's hot news in the press. So for instance, last year, the whole Shamima Begum debate came up as to whether or not she should be stripped of her citizenship and that sort of thing. And we say to Sue, right, you're going to have to argue in favour of this particular motion, or you're going to have to argue against it. You have to be skilled enough to be able to put views that may not necessarily be your own fairly, objectively and robustly to us. And when a counter argument is put your way, I'd only say, yes, make appropriate concessions if you need to, but be ready to fight your corner. It's how well you articulate your particular argument and how persuasive you are without being arrogant or argumentative that's really important. And finally, I would say in relation to questions, do you ask a question or don't you? I would say that most interviewers secretly hope that you don't ask any questions. If you get through to a second round interview at 5 St Andrews Hill, then ask your questions if you've looked at the website and you can't find an answer. Don't ask a question just for the sake of it. We know you're already interested in us because you've applied to us. You don't have to show off that you're asking some very clever question of us. Make sure you check the website first, because if you ask a question that is very obviously answered on our website, again, that goes badly in your against you, I would say. So make sure you've done your research before you ask a question, and leave all questions to the second round interview and only ask them if they're absolutely necessary. I've probably gone on far too long, so thank you for your patience, but I'm going to pass over to Sahar now, I think, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. Sahar, over to you.
Thanks, Gurdeep. Thanks, Francesca. What you've had there this evening is very comprehensive and solid advice that covers really 3 distinct stages of the process, and I think that reflects probably the audience. In broad terms, there's what I would classify as the developmental phase, so that's developing the experiences on your CV through your undergraduate and graduate studies. That's things like we've mentioned, mooting, debating, all of those sorts of things. And then specifically about the application form and then the interview process. During the course of those 2 very informative talks, I've actually taken 4 pages of notes myself, partly to avoid repetition, but also just because there's so many things in there which are so useful. So what I'll try and do, based on how much information you've had and how comprehensive it's been, is I'll try, probably without success, to add something to that, and then I'll try and approach the things that have already been said and just try and add to those if I can at all. In the first instance, though, what I would ask you to consider when you're approaching the application as a whole, and it's certainly been alluded to already, is the person marking it. Just try to understand that you're dealing with a professional person who is busy, and he or she will, depending on the set, depending on the nature of work that they're doing, either be marking this in the current climate, almost certainly, in fact, actually at home, but in normal circumstances, either in chambers or at home, they've got a number of other things to do, and they have set out time for this, and they've probably been allocated anywhere between 10 and 50 of these to mark. So the point that Gurdeep made at the start, which was it needs to stand out, is obviously a relevant one, but it's very difficult in a sea of so many applications for you to stand out. The reality is that so many candidates will have a good degree, so many candidates will have a good bar course result, so many candidates have climbed Kilimanjaro, so many candidates have done all of these wonderful things. And that's a reflection of all of you. It's a reflection of how hard you work and what you set out to achieve and how you go about it. But the way in which you can really make yourself stand out, if you come at it from a reality, which I think you have to accept, that you're talking in broad terms about a high caliber of applicant, is how you actually approach the form. And fundamentally, if you do not answer the question, you will not get off the ground. Those questions are there for you to answer. And one of the things that can be incredibly difficult as someone who marks these forms is a meandering, rambling answer that never actually approaches the thrust of the question. It's such an obvious thing, but as a barrister, it's routinely part of your life. And it's one of those things that will piss a judge off. If they ask you a question and you give them just a stream of consciousness without actually addressing the thrust of what they're getting at, you won't get very far. They've asked you a question because they want to know the answer to it, not because they want you to speak for the sake of it. That's why written submissions will often always, well, they will always, in fact, help you set out your case, but you use written submissions as an opportunity to grab attention, enough, in some contexts at least, for a judge or the reader to say, there's enough here for me to really want to actually hear from this person. So if you approach, and again, it's been alluded to or explicitly stated, if you approach your application in that way, if you recognize it as being written advocacy, almost like your skeleton argument, your opportunity to put before the judges, that's ultimately what they are, the people on the panel, not to put too fine a point on it, but that's what they're there to do. They're there to assess you. And the strength of the case that you've got to put forward, which is essentially your achievements and your profile, then you want it to be clear, you want it to be concise, and you want it to be complete. You want it to represent your case, and you want it to have been enough to get you over that threshold. Once you get into the interview room, well, that's a whole different ball game, and we can talk about that for a long time. Just pausing there for a moment, it's been mentioned, Francesca mentioned specifically about resources that are available. When I was applying for pupillage, which is, I think now probably 12 years ago or something like that, I never had access to this level of resource that students have now. The things that are available, and you don't have to actually physically go to events. Again, in the current climate, you can't necessarily do that anyway, but the resources that are available online are almost unprecedented, and they will give you an insight. I know that because I have seen so many. I know that because I've also had the opportunity to work with other people and create some. So in relation to written applications, there is a 5-part YouTube series that myself and a former colleague created, which you can find on YouTube, as I say, and that takes you through the written application process. More recently, during what was at that time called lockdown, is now called lockdown 1, we created with a group of other barristers and a couple of leading counsel as well, a resource for interviews. That's called the Fake Street Chambers series. That's also available on YouTube. That's a 3-part series. In the first part, you get to actually watch somebody do a pupillage interview. In the second part, they leave the virtual room and you listen to the panel dissect that person's interview and vote. And then in the third part, the panel, who all come from a composite of different practice areas, talk about their practice areas and some of the nuances of that. That's the Fake Street Chambers series. And I mention that not as a plug because there's nothing in it for me, but more specifically because it's a resource that exists and gives you insight and an opportunity, specifically something that I wanted to create, which was a kind of fly on the wall look at the interview process. But one thing which I think possibly hasn't been mentioned, which is linked to that resourcing and networking, which has been mentioned, is the prospect of mentors. There are so many mentors out there that you can get access to, either through your inn of court, through your university, through your bar course provider, or even through networking sites like LinkedIn. You have the opportunity now to have a barrister review your written application, provided he or she has time to do that and they're ethically able to do so. It won't be someone who is at the same set. Ordinarily, that's considered inappropriate. But you can also engage in mock interviews with these people. They will take an interest in your development and they will help you. So seeking out mentors, and it's a classic example of don't ask, don't get. If you don't ask people, if you don't approach them, what's the worst they can say? If you send someone a message on LinkedIn or an email and they don't reply, you've not lost anything, but you may gain the opportunity to have somebody who's willing to set out the time to look at your application and help guide you. On some of the other things that tend to come up, I think it's important to avoid cliches. There's a tendency and inclination sometimes to be focused on things that are quasi-legal or perceptions that people have from, I think this was mentioned before as well, in respect of pretending to be like a barrister. You don't need to use big words. You don't need to sound posh. You don't need to sound like you're from the south of England. Barristers are just doing a job. What good barristers have in common is that they're clear. The accent is irrelevant and your background is therefore irrelevant as well. What's important is that you're clear. And that approach of, I need to sound a certain way, whether in writing or in person, will actually do you a disservice. And that's a point that has been made, but one which I would underline because I see it over and over again. Approaching the things that you've already been told by the speakers, it's almost absurd to say that it goes without saying, because it really should go without saying, but everyone has said it because unfortunately it doesn't go without saying. Spelling and grammar is just something that you will not be forgiven for. You have time to put these applications together. You have time to write them out and to set them aside. And if what you're putting forward to us as people who are marking your application is strewn with errors, then it's not going to reflect very well, especially when your peers have made sure that there aren't errors in their applications. And when we have said, make it stand out, errors will make it stand out, I promise you. Very quickly, it will make it stand out for all the wrong reasons. A lot's been said about minis, marshalling, advocacy. So I don't want to cover the same territory other than to underline, of course, all of those things are important. One thing that possibly wasn't mentioned within that is you can still do mini pupillages or even vacation schemes or work experience in law firms as a way to discount that, so that if a panel decides to ask you, well, actually, you have applied here for a criminal pupillage because that's what we do, but why why is it that you don't want to do family? How do you know you don't want to do family? Because you're talking about publicly funded work here. There's plenty of opportunities at the family bar. Being able to point to having spent some time in another practice area gives you the opportunity to explain why you've looked into it and it's not for you. Without that, it's potentially a bit of a wishy-washy answer. So don't think that other aspects of work experience you've done are not relevant. Again, the point has been made. Please don't just regurgitate absolutely everything you've ever done in the way of work experience, because it will also get lost. You do need to keep it relevant, but occasionally you can tailor it to include something which on its face may not seem relevant, but can be used as an illustration of why you're so committed to the path that you've chosen. Within the context of research, which again has rightly been cited several times, the pupillage handbook's very important, but sometimes there are things missing. I never had any compunction the day before a pupillage interview calling the clerks in chambers, and I would ask who was on the panel tomorrow. Sometimes I would get short thrift, other times I would be told. And it was gold dust, because then I would spend that last evening just looking through the recent cases of the people that were going to be on the panel. It gave me a little bit more insight into who I was going to face. And these are the types of things which in the end can carry the day. Francesca mentioned, you know, a little bit of pandering to the ego. That may be a way forward. Obviously, you can't become sycophantic, because that's ridiculous, and also you may annoy half the other people on the panel if you're just talking about one person, how great he or she is. But if you have given yourself every opportunity to understand what you're facing, what you're also doing is telling the panel that you are ready for a career at the bar. And that is the overarching point in all of this. One of the key elements for a barrister, regardless of practice area, regardless of experience, regardless of pretty much anything, is preparation. You will hear it time and time again through pupillage. You will hear it from other people. You must prepare your case. And if we stick to the analogy that I raised at the start about how this is really your written advocacy, this is your application, which ironically enough is a phrase you will hear throughout your career, this is your application, because that's exactly what this is. And you won't go into court, not successfully anyway, having not prepared your application. And people who spend all day making applications, cross-examining witnesses, know when you haven't prepared. It comes across. When you have, it is impressive. And when you encounter an answer that really goes to the heart of your application, that touches on a weakness, that's the point at which the panel will really get to see you. That's when they will have discounted your preparation, because they can see you've done it. And now they want to test whether you've got what it takes to think on your feet, because this is about your potential for a barrister to be a barrister. It is not about you being a barrister today at the point of interview. I hope that's helpful. I've gone slightly over the 15 minutes there, but I'll pass back to Tanessa. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sahar, for that. And if I pass it over to everybody now for questions, so please don't be shy. Please open up and ask your questions. If you are going to be a barrister, it's something you're going to have to be comfortable with, is talking to strangers. So please, if anybody has any questions, please just...
Yeah, can I fire away first, please?
Yeah, go for it, Jazz.
Sorry. Thank you very much, all three of you. You've been great. I mean, like you guys said, sometimes it's repeating the obvious, but it needs to be heard. So thank you very much for that. My question is, in the application forms, I mean, we all do these application forms. Sometimes they're 5 pages long. And after filling all the information, you come to the end and it says, tell us anything that you may feel relevant in support of the application. Now, how does one utilize that section of the form?
I don't know if Francesca or Sahar have any other observations, but I would say it's yet another opportunity to sell yourself further. So within the application form, you'll have specifically addressed the questions that you've been asked, as Francesca said you must. So view that last box, the any other business box, as an opportunity to sort of bring it all together. And so if you feel you can make a pithy, succinct statement of your case within maybe 4 or 5 lines, I think there is no harm in doing that. But of course, what you mustn't do is just repeat that which you've already set out. So I think the box is there for a reason. And sometimes when it's done well, it really does end the application well. And you think, actually, that's quite nice. I like that.
Yeah, I'd agree with Gurdeep. It is there for a reason. I agree at no repetition, but at the same time, sometimes when you've got some killer points that you know are presented throughout your form, it might be useful to just have it as a very brief closing submission. And so maybe reinforce your best points there, but not in a way that is repetitive, but just is powerful and robust, I would say. There are sometimes sections on the form as well asking for any extenuating circumstances. If you have extenuating circumstances, use it. If a set of chambers decides to disregard it because they don't believe in extenuating circumstances, then you don't want to be part of that set anyway.
I'm going to disagree slightly, which is also something that barristers do a lot, particularly with each other, often on instruction. I would question why, if you have such a killer point, you haven't managed to weave it into the rest of the questions. There's a temptation sometimes with an empty box to think it just must be filled, otherwise you're missing an opportunity, and there's that sort of fear of missing out. Clearly, you've been given appropriate parameters by both Gurdeep and Francesca that repetition is to be avoided. But if you have something that's really stand out, I would think by and large you'll find a way to weave it in. Since it's been touched upon, extenuating circumstances is an important one. But again, similarly, I've found in the last couple of years, and I say that in particular because I know it's not been touched upon by way of introduction, which is a slightly bizarre point at which to do it, but I went from criminal practice and criminal pupillage through general civil into commercial and now international arbitration, and in fact from the self-employed bar to the employed bar. And in the last 36 months, I had the opportunity to set up a pupillage program, which meant writing the actual handbook and then creating the interview process. I did that, of course, with a number of other colleagues. And in that process, you begin to consider things like, well, institutional blindness, which has been mentioned already, increasingly important and adopted by a number of people. But what about extenuating circumstances? Then you start engaging with people about that. And sometimes people think it's just an opportunity to say something. And it really amazes me because it's so subjective, the range of things that people will put in. Some people will put in things like, you know, I broke up with my boyfriend of 14 months just before my exam and I struggled. And that's their explanation for a third class result in that particular exam. Other people will say, my parents were killed in a car crash 2 days before my final exam, and that's their explanation for a 2-1. Those things are completely different, and it's so subjective, and panels will approach it differently. But please do try and think about your answer. If you're going to give an extenuating circumstance, I've written about this recently actually. Firstly, be clear about what it was, what was the event. Secondly, explain the impact on you. And thirdly, make sure that it explains the actual mark. If the mark that you're seeking to explain isn't an anomaly, and in fact sits within a wider pattern of results, then really you haven't explained anything. So I don't know if I just flip that back to the panel, having now hijacked it and gone into extenuating circumstances in such detail. Would anyone say anything else about extenuating circumstances?
Francesca, go ahead.
I totally agree with you, Sahar. As you make reference to, there are very subjective views as to what amounts to an extenuating circumstance, and the two examples that you gave absolutely nail it. If it is going to be an extenuating circumstance, it really does need to be a powerful one. And so I can only really echo what you've said, and it's a good point, well made.
Yeah.
Sometimes people may not have extenuating circumstances, but they might want to explain a particular situation that had arisen, even though it's not extenuating. I think if there's a certain amount of humility involved in relation to that, where you concede, perhaps you've grown up a little later than everybody else, then that might well just see you through. But on the whole, if it is going to be something you're relying upon to justify a relatively low grade, then it needs to be pretty powerful.
I'd agree with what Sahar has said and Francesca's observation. It's a very careful line to tread between excuse making and genuine reasons for why you haven't met your usual high standards. And so it's a question of judgment, and that's obviously part of the skill of being a barrister anyway, trying to identify and ask yourself, is this really going to work for me? And I'd echo what Francesca said. Conceding some weaknesses within your application and recognizing that there are gaps or weaknesses is not necessarily a bad thing, because it shows some self-awareness. And the very worst thing is an applicant who's sat in front of a panel who tries to get them to believe that everything is rosy in the garden and they can see through the application. And so, you know, sometimes an applicant who says, I can see that my academics aren't great, but let me tell you about the good things within my application and take you to that. And so that's a clever way of, as it were, taking the agenda into a direction that you're more comfortable with and that you're on firmer territory.
Thank you for that question, Just Kira. Does anybody have any questions they want to say openly to the panel, communicate it verbally? Or should I just read the questions that are in the chat? No? Okay. What other resources would you recommend for research purposes aside of the Chamber's website, especially if you want to have fuller insight, i.e. their headline cases and future developments? So if we start with Gurdeep Baji. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I think it's something which I touched upon. I think the starting point must be the Chamber's website. As Francesca has said, the handbook is also an invaluable tool. Talking to other people sounds an obvious thing to say, but the bar is a relatively closed community. And so the more people you know, the more lawyers you get to know, ask them and say, well, what do you think about Citadel Chambers in Birmingham? I've made an application there. And somebody will know somebody who might be able to give you another angle or another perspective. So those are all things that I would encourage. Perhaps more specifically, if there's anybody in Chambers who you are particularly following, as it were, and they've dealt with a particular case that's become an authority, read around that case and demonstrate that you have a particular interest in that case and that person and the case they did and the way they did it. Because again, as Francesca said, again, it's a line to be trodden carefully, but a little bit of flattery can actually work well, as long as it's not, to use the expression I think Sahar used, sycophantic. I think showing interest, genuine interest in members of Chambers also underlines that you are genuinely interested, you're not just paying lip service.
Yes, can I echo that as well? I think one of the good resources that I have, I don't know if you'll have access to it, is something like Westlaw. If you know the members of Chambers that are in the set, type in their name in Westlaw, see what comes up, Google them. Might be that they've just been reported in a particular case that's finished in Maidstone Crown Court, or up at the Bailey, and it shows that you're keeping abreast of their particular achievements, but also it's likely that that sort of thing's going to come up in the interview when you get there. So that's a good resource. You can look at the Legal 500 and Chambers and Partners, as they'll identify who's particularly rated by their peers, and it may well be that there's reference there then to cases that you can follow up on. But there are many resources at your fingertips, but Google's an amazing one.
Yeah, I think all of that is correct. Westlaw's just been mentioned. Bailey, you come across people who pronounce that differently, but cases on Bailey, but also again, social media now, barristers and their chambers in particular, or if you're at the employed bar, the firms, they will be very quick to publicise cases of interest and results for members of chambers and barristers that are of interest. So places like Twitter and LinkedIn are just full of relevant and recent information. All you have to do is go on the chambers or the provider's page on those websites and scroll through, and you'll find a whole host of information. Don't forget that in some areas of law, so for example in arbitration, where it's all based on contractual rights, it's not necessarily publicised, but publications like the Global Arbitration Review will actually cover those things. And remember as well, just whilst we're talking about it, that the types of cases that people such as Gurdeep and Francesca are doing are very interesting and will often have nuances to them, but they're more sophisticated as far as practices are concerned. The cases that the junior tenants and juniors are doing are more likely to be the ones that you will come across in the first 5 or 6 years of practice. Cases in the magistrates' courts, for example, in the criminal context, those are rarely going to be cases that you see summaries of. So the best thing with those is when it is possible to just go into a magistrate's court, sit at the back and watch, because from my memory, magistrates' court cases in particular are often a variation on a theme because of the level of offending involved. So not to say once you've seen one, you've seen them all, because that's not true at all, but once you've seen about 150, then you're getting close to having seen a lot of them.
Thank you. So the next question, which Francesca already touched upon during her discussion, was what is the greatest challenge you have faced so far? So I don't know if Gurdeep, Baji and Sahar want to add anything to that on top of what Francesca said.
I think it's a legitimate question for a panel to ask. And I would agree with what Francesca said, that if you feel that you want to go into a personal realm, then that's perfectly permissible. But by the same token, if you can point to something which is more professional or to do with your academic progress, I think that's more preferable. And I'll tell you why. I have a memory of a pupillage interview maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in which an applicant started to tell us about a tale of woe, which included, to use Sahar's example, relatives dying within months of each other, and you could hear a pin drop, and it became rather uncomfortable, and none of us really knew where to go. And this applicant became quite tearful, and we all felt very sorry for her. And so it's a question of balance. And so if you have a challenge, as it were, in terms of your journey that you can point to, you've been brought up by a single parent, or you were brought up, I don't know, in difficult circumstances, you didn't go to the greatest school, something of that order, and you've demonstrated an ability to overcome some difficulty or barrier or hurdle, then I think that's preferable. But if it is something more personal, then again, if you feel you can deal with it and articulate it, then there's no bar to it. But with that caveat, I think, you know, it can have an effect where you can see sort of tumbleweed crawling across the interview room.
Yeah, I'd endorse that. I think the question touches on the right point, which is if you go too personal, then you almost end up just walking into extenuating circumstances. And I think the litmus test for you when you're considering whether you want to use a personal illustration would be to consider whether you are able to talk about it without being excessively emotive. Can you talk about this particular challenge that you faced under scrutiny? If there were further questions, can you do that without, as Gurdeep said in his example, getting emotional? Then you're probably onto something which is compelling. If, however, it is something which is emotive, difficult for you to talk about, but is relevant to your application, then it's probably more properly classified as extenuating circumstance.
Thank you. The next question is for Gurdeep. Is Citadel Chambers recruiting this year?
Yes. Short answer, yes.
Thank you.
As with most years, yeah, absolutely. And I am the head of the Pupillage Committee, so applications should be marked for my attention.
Thank you. Another question that's come through privately is in relation to if somebody doesn't drink. So if they're an individual that doesn't drink for religious reasons, so they don't necessarily opt to go to the pub, would that go against them if they don't drink?
I think that there's, this probably comes under an umbrella question really, which is more to do with backgrounds in general. The bar as a profession has changed so much in the last 10, 15 years since I've been involved with it. Some of the stories you hear about prior to certainly the 2000s in particular makes it sound like a really archaic, stuffy place. I think Francesca's touched upon it before when she's talked about whether a chambers is the right place for you. Frankly, there is no place now for anyone to judge you because you don't drink or because you are from a certain religious background or ethnic background or any characteristic at all, to be honest. If there is even a whiff of that, then the reality is that people within that person's organization should be condemning that behavior. You don't need to think about things like that unless you actually see them, because that's part of our past, and the bar collectively is moving forward and away from those sorts of things. So I can understand why you might feel that, but if you feel uncomfortable about going into a pub because you don't want to, then just say that, and that's fine. Yeah, that's how I feel about it anyway.
I'd echo everything that Sahar has just said. As a non-drinker myself, having done pupillage in London and then been a tenant in a set in Birmingham throughout my career, there have been umpteen opportunities and invitations to go to the pub. On occasions I've gone and sat there and had a good laugh with people and drank Coke. On other occasions I've said, it's not for me. But the older you get, the more mature you get and the more confident you are in yourself, you'll have the ability to say no. But as Sahar said, ultimately it matters not, because it's about what you do in chambers on your feet and as an advocate that matters, not how much of a good chap you may be at a bar. So don't feel that you have to do that or compromise your own beliefs or personality to fit in, because ultimately it really is a very minor part of it. I should say this though, there is a distinctly social element to being in chambers, which I think sometimes people forget, because although we're all individuals, we are still a team. And some of the best laughs I have are when I finished in court, particularly when I'm having a difficult time or doing a difficult case. You come back to chambers and you have a real giggle with colleagues in chambers. Sometimes people will go off to the pub sometimes people like me, particularly because I've got young children, I'll say, look, I need to get home. But, you know, there is a social element. So there is a time and a place where you can show your personality. It doesn't have to involve alcohol.
Yes, I suspect that question arose because one of the issues that I said was that we need to know that we can go to the pub with you, which is perhaps a poor turn of phrase. We need to know that you are have a decent personality, that we can get on with you. And as Gurdeep says, it's the sociable side of things in chambers that's important. And like Gurdeep, I've got young children, so I am rarely out and about, and often worry, in fact, that maybe I'm perceived as maybe a bit antisocial, but actually far from it. I'm very much embraced in my chambers and looked after, and certainly I can only speak for my chambers. I don't know other chambers, but we are a very welcoming set and welcome all people from all walks of life and all backgrounds, and everyone's individual views are very much respected.
Thank you. We have another question for Gurdeep. Will Citadel Chambers be recruiting 1 year in advance, i.e. to commence in 2022? They're not sure as it wasn't on the gateway.
The applications this year will be to commence in October of this year, because we didn't take on a pupil last year. But of course, depending on the candidate and their particular circumstances, of course, if somebody needed to defer, there's a good reason for that, Chambers would be sympathetic. And so it's never set in stone. And some years, for example, I expect Francesca will bear me out on this as well. If we're confronted with 2 exceptional candidates, we may take on 2 people. So it very much does depend on what that year's crop brings. But essentially, yes, we're looking for somebody to start this October, but subject to their own commitments.
Can I just make one point that that question has reminded me of, or rather the answers reminded me of? We're all hoping that this situation is going to end as soon as possible, but right now nobody knows, and there's a decent chance at least that it could go on for several months still. So think about how you appear when you're on a Zoom call. Advocacy in person is different from virtual advocacy, and all of us are having to learn that skill and develop it. But you need to understand yourself, how you come across when you're on a screen. And the easiest way to do that is to practice. You can practice with family, you can record it, but you really need to get a sense of yourself on screen and how you come across, because it's possible, although I hope, I emphasize again, I hope that that's not the case, but it's possible that your interviews, if and when you get there, will be virtual, and it won't do you any harm to consider how you come across on that format.
Yes, we've conducted some interviews via Zoom for third sixes during the pandemic, and it is interesting to see how people have developed and improved actually in relation to their Zoom calls, as it's something we're all becoming familiar with. I think it's likely to continue for a period of time, unfortunately. And so if the application process is concluding at the beginning of February, with interviews taking place next April, I suspect, certainly from 5 St Andrews Hill's perspective, we will be doing first round interviews through Zoom. So it's important to practice.
Thank you. Does anybody have any more questions? Because there's no more questions in the chat. Does anybody want to speak out and raise their questions? Please don't be shy. As I said, this is going to be your career. You're going to have to speak to people that you've never met before. No? Okay.
I received the question just beforehand, which I want to address. It was actually from someone who's not been able to attend in the end, or I can't see her name anyway. It was really, and it's a question that's common for students. So let me ask the question rather than answering it, and the panel can approach it, though I do have an answer as well. Throughout COVID, I've struggled with work experience. How hard is that going to hit my application?
I think allowances are inevitably going to be made. I spoke earlier about mini pupillages and the significance of those. In the forthcoming competition, I think all chambers will recognise that people haven't been able to engage in those sorts of activities, and so adaptations will be made. They are being made across the board in any sort of application. So, for example, I was talking to a colleague yesterday who had applied for Silk and was refused, and intends to apply next year. And the Silk Appointment Commission are also making adaptations because none of us are working to the extent that we're working. So applying that to our scenario in pupillage, I think adaptations will be made and allowances will be made.
Yes, I would say there will be some allowances, but at the same time, it's your opportunity to show what you're doing instead. So if you can't keep up with mini pupillages because there's just not the opportunity to do that one-to-one time with a particular member of chambers or with a set of chambers, then see whether or not you can go to the courts instead and at least show that you are taking an interest and understanding the procedures, seeing if there are some barristers there that you can speak to, making sure that you're well researched and that you're keeping up to date with developments in the law. If you address it in your application form and indicate, I had mini pupillages lined up at A, B, C, D and E, unfortunately none of them could actually come to fruition because of COVID, but instead I have done A, B, C, D, whatever, then that's going to help you. If you show that you're still willing, you're subscribing to newsletters, you are keeping up to date with webinars, and you're doing those sorts of things over and above your cohort that will be applying at the same time, then that will put you in good stead. There are ways around it, and the fact that you've not necessarily been able to undertake mini pupillages in the last year certainly won't be held against you, as long as you can show that you've gone the extra mile with the other elements of your application.
So another question has come in. If you applied last year for pupillage, the last round, but your application was withdrawn by chambers, is it wise to resubmit the same application or just redraft your whole application if the questions are exactly the same as last year?
Tanessa, when you say an application has been withdrawn by chambers, does the person asking the question mean that it's been a rejected application?
No, it was withdrawn due to COVID. So because chambers weren't prepared for video interviews, so they withdrew.
Certainly. What I would expect to see if someone is a new applicant and they'd got through a particular process with RSET, I'd expect to see some development on their form to show what they've done in the last year. If they're simply copying and pasting what they've done the previous year, that's probably not ideal. That said, all of our forms are considered afresh, and our applicants that got through to interviews this year where we had to abandon the process, they are automatically having an interview for the following year, but they will, of course, when it comes to it, automatically get an interview, but then still be competing against the new applicants that are also coming through as well. So show us what you've done to take advantage of the extra year you've got, rather than simply resting on your laurels. But if you had an interview lined up with our set and it didn't go ahead because of the pandemic, then you've obviously reached a particular standard, which is good. So I build on that rather than adjust it, unless you obviously are keen to change your application generally.
Yeah, I think any opportunity to finesse an application, it should be embraced, and don't ever think that the application is set in stone because you're happy with it. As your experiences increase, as you do new things, always go back to the application and think, how can I mold it and shape it better and make it even more attractive? So don't just leave it as it was 12 months earlier. I simply agree with what Francesca has said.
Sahar, did you want to add anything?
No, I'd endorse that completely. I know some sets will have a different view on it. So if it's ambiguous, then call up the chambers, and there won't be that many, so you won't annoy anyone, and it's a legitimate question. Just call them up and say, I got through to interview last time, the process was withdrawn, can I just confirm what the situation is in relation to those applications? Chambers will almost certainly have a policy. If they don't, then they need to have one.
Thank you. Another question that's just come in is, I am a recent graduate but have severely struggled with securing legal work. I was just wondering whether there is any advice that the panel would kindly provide regarding overcoming this and addressing this on my application form.
It's difficult to comment without knowing why they've severely struggled. If it's because they're in a particular location that's been in severe lockdown, for instance, and there really hasn't been the opportunity to go to court or to try and get paralegaling work, then it's best to address that head on and explain what your intentions were and why you've been thwarted. If, however, you're in an area where there is the work there, but the likelihood is that you either haven't applied or you haven't perhaps applied to the right kind of places, then that's something that's going to be more difficult to address in the application form. But certainly through chambers, we get approached by firms of solicitors to see whether or not any of our successful pupillage candidates, so those that are waiting to join us, are happy to do paralegaling work. And in fact, they've been in work throughout the pandemic, even while some of the other fee earners have been laid off. So there definitely are work opportunities out there. So if you haven't been able to get anything, you need to explain what you tried to do and why you've been thwarted, I would say.
Does any of the other panel members want to add anything to that?
No, thank you.
I think also if you have a look at recruitment agencies, they're quite good. Law Absolute, Read, places like these, because I managed to find a job. So I was laid off, furloughed, because they had too many paralegals on the Grenfell inquiry, and it took me 2 months. I was on the case of every agency I could think of. I was calling them, and I managed to secure my current role with Lambeth Council. So if you just keep harassing the agents, you know, even if you have to change phone numbers to keep harassing them to chase up where your application's got to, just do it, because that's what I did, and I managed to find something within 2 months before my furlough period came to the end. So I can always provide the contact details for those agencies if anyone wants them. Another question is, I am in my 3rd year of LLB. I will start the bar course in September 2021 and will finish in May 2022. Can I still apply for pupillage with Citadel Chambers this year?
I think you should be applying next year because, of course, you still have to complete your degree and then bar school. So you would be wishing to start pupillage in October 2022. So I think this would be one round too early. When I spoke about deferral earlier, that's on the basis of somebody having completed bar school, but for whatever reason not being ready to start in October. So I think that would be 12 months thereafter.
I can, well, I suppose I'll disagree slightly, and it may be that I've misunderstood the question, but the earliest you can actually get pupillage is as a 3rd year undergraduate. If you apply during your 3rd year, it's extremely rare for people to do it, but I have known people to do it. If you get pupillage as a 3rd year undergraduate during that window, and it's to start October the following year, then you've got that time to graduate, go on, complete the bar course, and then start pupillage. It's very rare. It gives you no real time, but in theory it can be done. When I say it gives you no time, most people will have a year or two between finishing the bar course and actually starting pupillage. In some cases, many more. And that's an opportunity to broaden your horizons. It's an opportunity to experience different things. So don't wish away the time that you have. In that sense, I'd agree with Gurdeep, because even if you do get pupillage, I think you may miss out on opportunities that would benefit you in the long run.
Yeah.
Francesca, did you want to add anything to that, or no?
No, we're in a very different regime, I think, because we go through the gateway. So applicants that are coming to us now or in this round will be for a 2022 start. And so we're quite regimented in that regard. I would say that all good interview practice is important, but if we had people applying to us now that weren't able to start in 2022, that would be a problem. It wouldn't be able to roll over to the following year. I think we have to adhere by an open policy, and that is we're only recruiting for 2022.
Thank you. I just had one question myself for the panel as I'm applying for pupillage as well. I know, Sahar, you've said in the past to try and use the maximized number of applications we can make through Gateway, but also off Gateway. I think my concern was if I focused on, say, 20 or more applications, given the ones that are off Gateway, I would be a bit worried about not having tailored my applications properly to those sets and concentrated properly on the applications and just focusing on the quantity rather than the quality. What would your advice be on that?
I think that the answer will vary person to person. The reason I've always given the advice that I think in my day you didn't have 20 options for a start. I think back then it was possibly 10, maybe 12. Very, very few people are frankly brilliant enough to be able to say with a straight face, there's 4 chambers that I want to go for, and those are the 4 that I'm going to apply to, and let the chips fall where they may because I'm going to get one of those. You have 20 opportunities to get pupillage, and that's through the Gateway, of course. When I answered that question, the first time I was asked, I think it was the day after the forms were released. And I said, if you give 1 hour every night, I can't remember the exact calculation, but it worked out at something like 45 hours you had for your applications. And that includes doing the research. I was making the point at that particular moment in time that 45 hours alongside whatever other commitments you have is sufficient to do the research and apply to 20 sets of chambers and to tailor it. I just don't believe that 45 hours isn't enough. And I don't believe that an hour a night is an excessive ask for your future career. So my answer is, when the form becomes available, and I'm speaking specifically about the Gateway, you have sufficient time, you have 20 opportunities, you can tailor it. I'm not saying apply out and out for the sake of it to sets where you've got no interest in that practice at all to make up the numbers. But I am saying that there may be sets of chambers that aren't your dream set, but they may well be where you end up. And if you don't apply to them, that will never happen.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Hi, Tanesi. I had a question, please.
Yeah.
It's Farin Ali.
Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for a great event. Thank you, Sahar, Gurdeep and Francesca. It's been really useful. I had a question just on the back of what Francesca mentioned, and I think it was echoed throughout in respect of networking and to be able to build connections and to acquire clients. I mean, if a candidate has a set of clients which he or she can bring to the chambers, how would you recommend demonstrating that in the application form? And would there be a requirement from the chambers to be able to submit some form of written confirmation? I say that with the view that, not being super specific, but I do have some, thankfully due to networking, some solicitors that have been giving me work. But if I was to say that I would like to bring those to the chambers, would there be a requirement to submit some form of written confirmation from those solicitors? And how would you recommend really articulating that in the application form? Sorry, a bit of a wordy question.
Shall I deal with that, as it was an issue that I raised during the course of my discussion? In reality, if somebody says in their application form that they can bring work with them, then we tend to take that with a pinch of salt. And the reason for that is they might have the best of intentions, but actually things move on. And we understand that, but we do appreciate the fact that people are doing their networking. What it should never come across as is some sort of sweetener or bribe. Certainly I would look quite badly, I think, on an applicant that said, oh, if you give me this, I'll give you these particular solicitors, because it's something that you can't make good on. And certainly we won't be bribed in that way. It provides an unfair advantage, obviously, to those that are at uni and haven't had the opportunity to sort of network as much as possible. So there is a particular way that you can phrase it that indicates that you've worked really well with these particular firms. They're really supportive of my career. Leave unsaid the fact that they're likely to follow you. From that sort of representation, you're indicating that you're already networking, you're already doing a great job, and that you have the support of them. And if things go well for you, absolutely excellent, all well and good. If those particular firms follow up on that, that's great. And if they don't, they don't. So certainly for my part, I wouldn't be asking for any form of proof of the fact that you've been working with somebody. But if, for instance, you're working well with a particular firm and you know that they champion you, put them down as a referee. That would speak volumes, in fact, that if you've got a referee that is from a firm of solicitors that you've indicated within your firm or in your form, forgive me, already vouches for you, then it all ties up nicely. So what's not said is that they're likely to follow you, but it's clearly inferred from the nature of the form, but without it being dangled as a sort of bribe. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you very much, Francesca.
Don't forget that's almost tangential to the main issue here. The panel is not going to be focused or obsessed with whether or not you're bringing work. You're not there for a BD role. You're there as a prospective pupil, which means they are looking at your potential to practice as a barrister. Those things are relevant and interesting, but I think what Francesca says is right. Sitting on a pupillage panel, I'm going to be dubious about it anyway, and it's definitely not really going to inform whether or not you have potential as a practitioner, which is the focus of the interview and why you're there. So it's relevant, but I don't want other people listening to think, oh, hang on now, I haven't got that, so what am I supposed to do? It's just, it's an aside, as I say, tangential. It's not a focus. It's not something, Fareen, to answer your question, that you need to think, well, chambers are going to go and start asking the solicitors, well, how much are you sending through her? What's that going to look like in her first year? Have you got a 5-year business plan? That's just not going to happen.
Can I add to that, Sahar, in fact, that when we're interviewing, we look at whether we're going to entrust you with our solicitors, not the other way around. So don't worry about it too much if you haven't got a firm of solicitors that's championing you at this stage.
Thank you so much. I'm just conscious of time because we have gone on a bit. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up. I just wanted to ask if the panel had any concluding comments that they wanted to make in relation to pupillage.
No, just to underline everything that's been said by the speakers today. You've had the benefit of hearing 3 different and I hope helpful perspectives. And bear in mind all of those things, and even the obvious and basic things, and including spelling and grammar, because you wouldn't want to fall foul of something so basic and something which is so easy to address.
Yes, I'd just add to that, I wish you all the very best of luck, and I hope to bump into you at court at some point. And if you are at court and you recognise me, come and say hello and introduce yourself.
Yeah, likewise.
From me, just the 3 words answer the question: please, I'm begging you, answer the question. I can't emphasize that enough. If you don't answer the question, it's over.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much. And for all the students as well, thank you for attending today. We know we've had quite a few messages regarding the next event, Sikhs and human rights. So we will be announcing it in due course. We'll have a flyer out for that event as well, including the next pupillage event that we'll be carrying out in January from a pupil's perspective. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for attending today, especially thank you to the panel for taking time out of their busy schedules to do this for us. So thank you so much. I know I found it very helpful and I'm sure the others have too. It would be great to get some feedback from everyone on the event as well. And we have recorded it, so we are hoping to publicize it soon. So thank you so much, everyone. And all the best.
Thanks for organising it. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yep.
Is it just
Well
us
done.
left? Thank you.
Well
Yeah,
done.
that's
I
it for
thought
us.
that went very well. A very, very good selection of speakers. And you know what? Everybody brought something different. I like that there wasn't just one sort of train of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like a yes man approach, because